So let's talk about the much neglected Primaris Reiver squad. Games Workshop may have made their rules consistently awful, but let's talk about one way that we could perhaps get a bit more value out of them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of the Primaris Reiver squad in the new Space Marine Codex. In the video we'll talk over their models and their datasheet, a few potential combos, particularly focusing on what they can do with the Phobos Lieutenant, and how I'd think about using them in game. The Reivers were one of the first new Primaris miniatures that Games Workshop unleashed for the Space Marines, basically Primaris Terror Troops in Phobos armour, and they're the spooky scary Space Marines that fight in skull masks, and perhaps even more concerningly for the enemy, some brutal shock grenades. They're generally employed in small numbers to sow terror and discord throughout the enemy's ranks, potentially disrupting entire formations with their surprise assaults. For the models themselves, you get 10 in a box, and they have at least a fair bit of customization on the kit. You can either go for half helms or full helms on the skull masks, and you get the option to choose between the combat knife and bolt pistol or the bolt carbine, plus the option to choose either grapnel launchers or grav shoots for how they get into battle. I do quite like the part that's got the Reaver firing the grapnel launcher out. That is a very cool miniature bit indeed. Can't help but think that that's going to have a very high chance of breaking pretty quickly though. I feel like the models maybe aren't as universally liked as some of them in the Primaris range. Kinda depends whether you like the Spec Ops Phobos and the Skull Mask vibe that they've got going on. Some people absolutely love them. They're definitely a little bit non-traditional for Space Marines though. The kit's priced at £37.50, $60 or €50 from Games Workshop. In general I feel like the 10-man Space Marine boxes tend to be some of the better ones out of their range at least. Definitely a lot more models for your money compared with the 5-man or the 3-man ones. And the points per dollar isn't terrible for 40k, getting 2.8. You can also get some in the Space Wolves Combat Patrol. As always, you can find these at a discount in the links down in the video description. Element Games in the UK has them for £32, Gap Games in Australia for $74 Australian dollars, and anything bought through those do help to support the channel. Rules-wise, Games Workshop really does seem to have had it in for Reivers literally ever since they came out. I don't think that there's been any point in the two editions since their models dropped that Reivers have been considered a particularly strong choice for Space Marines, and most of the times have tended to rank amongst the very weakest models that you can field. It's probably due to a rather unfortunate combination of weapons that only really kill infantry, leadership manipulation rules that often tend to be kind of niche in 40k in general, and also having loads of competition from all the different other flavours of Space Marine infantry that you can field, all with their own draws. For their current incarnation in 10th edition, they're 85 points per 5 of them, 170 for 10. In general, with these sort of Space Marine units, particularly the more infiltration disruption type ones like the Reivers, people tend to go for 5-man units more commonly than 10. And they've got a standard sort of Space Marine profile, toughness 4, 2 wounds and a 3+ save, not too bad for 85 points I guess, and they're only objective control 1, so they won't hold points quite as good as things like intercessors or assault intercessors. Being Phobos foot troops, they do get the smoke keyword, which is kind of helpful. Gives them another option for defensive stratagem along with armour of contempt, -1 to hit, and getting the benefit of cover is quite good value for 1 CP if they happen to be attacked when they're out in the open. For the selling points on Reivers, I feel like the ways that they can get into battle is one of the most interesting. You either basically have the choice of giving them grav shoots or grapnel launchers, both of which have their advantages. The grapnel launchers usually might mean that you're typically starting on the board with them. This means they're probably going to be using the Scout 6 inches move to get them into the midfield and start skirmishing with the enemy there nice and early. And the grapnel launchers, when they're moving around, means that they get to move vertically for free, so they're only really measuring the horizontal distance. Means that you could have some interesting deployment options with them, such as starting fairly high up in a ruin to basically keep themselves safe from enemies, or moving into the same if there's ones in the midfield if it's going to keep them safe somehow. Quite good fun and means that they interact with terrain better than most. The other option is the grav shoots, and that just gives them the option to deep strike instead. Kind of relevant with a Phobos Lieutenant, as we'll get onto, but they may be competing a bit against jump intercessors for the same role here, and they do certainly have a lot of draws to them. In 10th edition, Games Workshop tried to make the Reivers attacks a little bit more exciting by giving them precision on most of their weapons. It means that they can potentially directly target characters within units, really quite nice if you've got cheap support characters buffing a big squad. I'm maybe just a little bit skeptical as to how useful it really is on them. Their damage output is at least fairly close range, and with all their attacks being strength 4 and either AP 0 or just AP 1 for the few pistol shots they get, I think they're not really in a position where they're going to reliably wipe out lots of characters, and a lot of their damage is melee focused as well, meaning that they actually need to charge the character and risk getting hit back hard. For their actual war gear options though, you get the choice between bolt carbine and close combat weapon, or special issue bolt pistol and combat knife, and the two I think are at least fairly well balanced damage wise. The bolt carbines are basically bolter profile without any AP, 2 shots to 24 inches with the precision keyword, and if you select that one then you get 3 attacks at strength 4 in melee without the precision, or if you go for the special issue bolt pistol then you get just a single shot to 12 inches, this one does get AP -1 on it, and then you get to attack in combat with the combat knife which does gain precision, and that gives you 4 attacks again at strength 4 AP 0. Overall though, this has basically been the weakness of Reivers ever since they came out. All their melee weapons do generally just do damage to hordes quite well, but nothing really more serious than that. If you have an 85 point unit of them that you do manage to successfully deliver to the front, it gets to both shoot and then go on to charge and fight. With both loadouts, they kill around about 8 termagants or guardsmen, around about 3 wounds to standard sized Space Marines, or about 1 wound to Terminators or 3+ save vehicles. Basically that adds up to being fairly good against hordes, fairly weak against Space Marines, and utterly dreadful against anything that's tougher than them. It's just a bit unfortunate given that you might be playing against an army that doesn't have any options that are less tough than standard Space Marines, and some armies might have entire armies where you've got 2+ saves or massive amounts of vehicles. It also doesn't really make them particularly helpful from a character killing point of view, as even if you do manage to, say, deliver them against a unit where you can deal maximal shooting and then maximal melee damage to them, you're probably not odds on to even kill a Space Marine support character, which I'd say is perhaps the bare minimum for making precision attacks worth it. Finally, we get onto their morale rules, of which they have 2. Their primary terror troops thing is that any enemies within 6 inches get a -1 to both battle shock and leadership tests. Not awful, and kind of on brand I suppose. If enemies do have to take battle shock, then they're a bit more likely to fail, though as ever with battle shock it doesn't exactly guarantee a fail or anything like that. Even if you're fighting against something that was leadership 7 before and then goes to test on an 8, then you've still got a 43% chance for the enemy to pass. It's a bit better than a coin flip, but not by much. Otherwise, their secondary special rule is to hand out a battle shock test to 1 unit in engagement range of them. That one happens at the start of the fight phase, so it could be helpful for preventing certain stratagems and things, maybe the combat interrupt or some sort of damage or defensive stratagem that the enemy might have. But in general, battle shock tests that are handed out in the fight phase are kind of weak. Even if they do wind up failing, which they might not, your opponent might not have wanted to use any stratagems on them whatsoever, and when it gets back to the opponent's command phase once more, they just automatically heal it anyway, so it's not going to be relevant for primary objectives for the most part. Basically, the battle shock rules I think are just a bit short-ranged and dependent on them being in melee, and they can't really threaten all that many heavy troops in melee. If they charge things that are actually good in combat, they're probably going to be taking more damage than they dish out. Overall, I'd say not really the best base stats for a unit in 10th edition, but they do have perhaps 1 saving grace in the Phobos Lieutenant, who does make the unit a bit more interesting. In the core Codex Space Marines, they have 4 character attachment options: the Phobos Lieutenant, which seems like the best to me, their own dedicated Reiver Lieutenant, which is perhaps a spectacularly bad one, and then the Phobos Captain and Librarian. I feel like the Phobos Captain maybe isn't the best choice for these guys. He can't deep strike, and I feel like they're not going to be the top unit that you're usually going to want to use stratagems and things on, though it's not awful to have him somewhere in your army if you've got loads of Phobos for his redeploys. The Phobos Librarian I think I'd rate second best though. It gives you lone operative style protection for the unit, plus a bit of damage threat between his smite and his combat weapon attacks, though in general he seems to be a lot more popular on infiltrators, as some pretty excellent objective securing, meaning that you can't be shot outside of 12 inches, and you also can't deep strike within 12 inches of them. Onto the lieutenants though, and I thought I'd just mention the Reaver Armor Lieutenant, as he literally can't join anything else. He's 55 points and lacks the deep strike keyword, and doesn't really do too much for the squad's damage output, as he has just a bunch of attacks at AP 0, so kind of more of the same really. He does grant lethal hits to the unit, which would be kind of helpful at punching up slightly against your targets with bad saves. Should help at least stack a few more armor saves on vehicles and things if they happen to wind up in combat with them, I guess. But unfortunately his secondary core rule just really isn't all that great, boosting their terror troops aura by 3 inches, so just a little bit more of a wide aura of battle shock debuff, and it's still not relevant enough to be relevant after coming out of strategic reserves or something, and they can't even deep strike anyway as he lacks the keyword and can't take a grav shoot. Overall, between all that and his limited unit selection, he's probably one of the most niche or bad units in the Space Marine Codex. Much more positively for the Reaver squad though, there's the Lieutenant in Phobos armor. He's 55 points and has the option of leading some of the other Phobos as well. And again, he doesn't really add all that much in terms of actual general threat to the unit, just a bunch more strength for AP 0 both at range and in melee. As with the Reaver Lieutenant, he adds lethal hits to the unit, which is helpful, making them a tiny bit more well-rounded. The real selling point for this guy though is his shoot and fade special rule. Basically after his squad makes a shooting attack, they get to immediately move d6 inches, and compared with really quite a lot of rules in Warhammer 40k, this one's surprisingly unrestricted. There's nothing to say that you can't do it out of deep strike or anything, and there's nothing to stop you charging after they've made that move as well. A lot of similar units out there say that you can't go on to charge again after you've done that. It means that he's kind of uniquely interesting for the Reivers themselves, as he can deep strike alongside them with the grav shoot, buff their damage a bit, and then go on to move d6 inches, and then go on straight to charge after that. Essentially it makes for a 3d6 inch charge range out of deep strike. Just in theory, if you did want to try and make Reivers work as best as possible, you could either go with him with either 5 Reivers or 10 Reivers, and honestly if I'm being sensible then 5 Reivers might realistically be the way to go. Even if you are creating a very small and fragile unit with less damage output, it's generally a bit more useful for utility units not to cost loads and loads of points. If we did go all in on Big Reiver Surprise though, it'd be 225 points for 10 Reivers plus Phobos Lieutenants. Maybe jump in turn 2 out of Deep Strike, shoot either with the pistols or the combat blades, move d6 inches, and then follow that up with a d6 inch charge after that. Theoretically you should make a 9 inch charge around about 3/4 of the time with that, and if you do budget in a command point reroll either for a very low advanced roll or a very low charge roll, then they should be really quite reliable to get into combat. I think it does make them kind of interesting, as outside of things like rapid ingress, there's just not really that many things that just pop up out of Deep Strike and make a very likely charge, at least not within the Space Marine Codex. For their damage output, if you went for a big squad of these with the Phobos Lieutenant and took the pistols and combat blades, you'd have a big 57 precision attacks total, as you'd expect, fairly genuinely threatening against hordes, 26 slain termagants there. And it does chip some wounds off most other things, though still kind of lackluster for 225 points worth of value. 4 standard Space Marines, around 4 wounds to Terminators, or about 5 wounds to most 3+ save vehicles. At least it gets them to the point where they should pretty reliably at least kill a Space Marine character at the very least, and hopefully take a chunk out of the rest of the squad as well. Overall, definitely still going to be specialising in horde clearance and not going to be very good against elite type armies, but having a squad that can drop down and just almost guarantee a charge out of reserve is genuinely quite powerful, and could be fairly big on objectives or even just disrupting and annoying the enemy, making some of their key units have to fall back the next turn. I'd say that could perhaps be one of the strongest ways of using the Reiver unit. There are plenty of other ways that you can support them. I'd say perhaps the other most interesting thing coming from the First Company Task Force. For generic Space Marine stuff, Oath of the Moment could help them out a bit, potentially fishing for lethal hits if you just need every single tiny bit of damage output out of them, but in general you want to use that on something that's got better damage just flat. And otherwise they've got Armour of Contempt and Smoke, which could be both good durability stratagems, helpful enough if they need to desperately cling to life on an objective, or maybe the grenade stratagem for a burst of mortal wounds that might just be enough to tip the balance against something that they just can't really kill otherwise with a bunch of AP0 attacks. In general though, I don't really feel like they're a unit that you want to go crazily heavy on the support for. They are low damage output and generally kind of low investment. Transports and external firepower buffs and any damage things might just be more efficient used elsewhere. From the Codex Detachments, the Vanguard Spearhead could be interesting enough for them, giving them a little bit of extra durability at range, and being a Phobos unit they're more relevant than most there. You could allow them to return to reserve for another deep strike perhaps, or do a 6-inch reactive move if the opponent gets too close. Both of those could be really quite disruptive in the right situation. I feel like perhaps my favourite thing that they can get from the Codex Detachments is weirdly enough from the First Company Task Force though. Most of the stratagems aren't very relevant on them, but they've got a rather good warlord trait called Fear Made Manifest for 30 points that I think probably does enough to tip the Terror Troops thing from being kind of awful to actually kind of useful. This one means that if you fail Battle Shock within 6 inches of the bearer, then the enemy squad just flat out loses a model, which could be kind of big given that even things like Custodes and Space Marines would have pretty reasonable chances of failing given the Reiver debuff. That goes up to D3 models automatically lost once per game. It means that theoretically, even if something like a Terminator squad charged them, they'd have around about a coin flip chance of losing D3 of their models straight out, which could be rather brutal. It might be chasing yet more investment out of trying to make their Battle Shock rules good, and I'm not sure it's going to be the most competitive thing given that it's so swingy, but it certainly seems like it could be a fun use for them if you wanted to try and make a slightly meme unit work. It could get genuinely good for any other things that could force Battle Shock test though. Infernus Marines or Whirlwinds combined with that, plus Reivers managing to get close to an enemy unit somehow, could actually do enough to genuinely make this pretty savage against big value enemy units. Otherwise, for the other detachments, there's a few things that could be handy. Gladius allows easy advance and charge if you're starting on the board, and the Lance melee stratagem in Assault Doctrine could give you +1 to wound and extra AP. Between the two of those, that makes them a lot more threatening, particularly with the lethal hits of the Lieutenant as well. Otherwise, the Firestorm Assault Force could give you Strength 5 carbines or pistols when they drop in. The Assault keyword could be handy, and they could use Crucible of Battle for +1 to wound if they needed to punch up, but it might be better on other things in the army. Otherwise, I feel like a few of the other detachments are kind of niche. The Stormlance could give you Advance and Charge, and the potential to reactive move 6 inches. Otherwise, for the more divergent chapters, perhaps the most relevant might be the Space Wolves, who get their own unique reiver version in the Hounds of Morkai. These guys are 90 points for 5 of them, 180 points per 10, so they do pay a 5-point premium over the standard reivers, and they do have some side grades as well as upgrades. They can't take grav shoots, so you can't just deep strike them in wherever you want to. If they wanted to do reserve things with a Phobos Lieutenant, I guess that would be going into strategic reserve. They definitely have one big selling point though, in that both of their bolt pistols and their combat knives all gain devastating wounds, making them just enormously better against anything that's got high saves, actually quite likely to punch some okay damage through, and massively better against Psychers as they wound those on an automatic 4+. It would make these guys genuinely actually kind of great damage dealers against any psychic threat, though that's not going to be something that you face in every enemy army. Otherwise, they get a 6+ invulnerable save, which could be handy from time to time, though most of the time it won't be relevant. Hand out a battle shock test within 12 inches that's worse against Psychers, and a better invulnerable against psychic attacks as well if relevant. Overall, I think they're interesting enough. I'd probably rate their base datasheets a little bit more interesting than standard reivers out of the Space Wolves Codex. Having some damage output that's actually worth something I think is kind of big, and massively so if there's loads of Psychers in your meta. Otherwise, for the Divergent chapters, the Blood Angels could have them hit fairly significantly harder in melee. +1 strength and +1 attack could make the Deep Strike Delivery combo more interesting. Definitely some interest there, given that they're one of the few units that can very reliably come out of Deep Strike without using Rapid Ingress. Black Templars could get them Feel No Pain or various other melee buffs. I feel like their Utility Disruption unit thing might be very nice with the chance to trap units in melee. Death Watch have various extra damage buffs, and their bolt carbines could actually be some fairly serious anti-infantry sniping power if you popped the 2+ anti-infantry stratagem on them. If you did say have a full squad of those for 170 points, you could be stacking a whole load of saves on an infantry character. And you can take them in the Spectre's kill team, but maybe there's not really a lot of reason to do so when you could be having things like Eliminators or Suppressors instead. Otherwise, Dark Angels maybe don't do so much for them. There's a few relevant stratagems, and Space Wolves have good sagas if they can be activated, plus Hounds of Morkai as their unique options. Overall, I feel like even with the best support and played to their best of their ability, there's not really too much getting around the fact that Reivers are basically one of the weakest units in Codex Space Marines, just due to their tried and tested combo of damage being quite bad, terror rules not really doing all that much, and just heavy competition from a lot of other similar price Space Marine units with good advantages, both as more mainline damage dealers and also within their utility unit role. For Deep Strike infantry harassment type units, I feel like the Jump Intercessors would definitely be worth a mention. Also 85 points, come with a Power Fist and AP -1 melee, and of course jump packs to make them fly very fast, and even mortal wounds on the charge. They can't get as a reliable deep strike delivery, but they can just bound up the board behind terrain anyway, and can still just drop down and do secondary actions and things just as well as Reivers can. Otherwise, Inceptors are a great choice for close range drops, again for secondaries and things, plus threatening things that you might not normally be able to. Scouts and Eliminators are both really quite awesome forward deploy type units, Scouts jumping on and off the board and being very expendable at just 55 points, and Eliminators with some precision damage and move shoot move. And you'd also be thinking about things like Infiltrators, Incursors, Assault Intercessors and Regular Intercessors, all of which have their own advantages too. Overall, between all this, it is just kind of rare to see Reivers played in any great numbers in any sort of competitive list whatsoever. I feel like Games Workshop would have to make them really quite cheap indeed for people to start taking them, but it probably wouldn't be impossible if they did slash the points cost to the extent where they're kind of similar to things like Black Templar Crusaders. I feel like if they're not going to boost their rules, then dropping by another 10 points or so might be what's necessary if you do want to see them played compared with the others. Perhaps to really fix them, I feel like their terror rules just need to be a bit better. Battle Shock's just not really all that impactful at the moment, particularly when the opponent can just heal it at the start of their turn if you have inflicted Battle Shock at the end of yours. If Games Workshop were to tweak the Battle Shock system to make squads need to have to regroup or something, then that could be quite a big deal. In any case, let me know what you make of the Primaris Reiver squad. Have you used these guys at all in 10th edition so far? And what do you make of the idea of jumping them in with a Phobos Lieutenant? Is that just a meme and too many points invested? Or could it be kind of useful to jump a unit directly into enemy lines? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep all the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.